Hey all, EC here, and today we're going to be going over every major console that's available via the Nintendo Switch Online and Nintendo Switch Online expansion packs. If you obviously pay for the subscription service, there's 8 consoles, I believe, that's on this list. I'll be going through them, showing obviously the images of the icons for these. And obviously, if you are interested in more content like this, make sure you subscribe and like all that sort of stuff. And let me know what you think, let me know what your favourite console on here is, and let me know. So, we're going to start with the base tier Switch Online service, which includes NES games, which are NES obviously being the first major home console released by Nintendo. They did do some sort of Pong clone consoles back in the day, but the first major cartridge-based console that Nintendo released was obviously the NES, otherwise known as the Famicom in Japan. This is obviously the first console we got with the Switch Online service, and obviously is arguably the most complete library as well, because obviously how big the library of games is that is available that are on the app. So NES, obviously the first major one on our list. Next one we got to go over is Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom, as it's known in Japan, was the second console added to the list, and it is obviously, the Super Nintendo is the second, Nintendo home console that they ever made. It obviously has some great games like Super Mario RPG, which was remade for Switch. Had obviously other great games like, we had Earthbound, for example, which was a huge hit. So that's the Super Nintendo. The third game console on our list is the Game Boy. The Game Boy is the final one on the base tier. I believe it's the final one on the base tier anyway. I'll have to double check. But it is the Game Boy, and it is probably the most iconic handheld console ever made. Everyone knows what the Game Boy is. Many old people still refer to any gaming system as a Game Boy. It's quite interesting to see. And they have got a strong lineup of games on the app so far. There are some notable omissions, like, for example, the Pokemon series. But hopefully Nintendo will improve that as it goes on. Now we're going to start getting into the expansion pack. And we're going to start the expansion pack going on the N64. The N64 has obviously 2 different apps. One for the mature games like Perfect Dark, and one for the more family-friendly titles like Super Mario. Right? So, with these obviously, the console, obviously you get games like Super Mario 64, you get games like Banjo-Kazooie, some iconic games for both Nintendo and Rare. I think it's probably the best console on the list so far, because obviously it's got a great library. And really, I don't see really much else what they can add to this version of the service, with the N64 games basically mostly complete, besides a bunch of movie licensed games. So, the next one on our list, this one's a bit of a weird one. This is the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis, which is obviously the only console on this, service which isn't owned by Nintendo. It was never made by Nintendo, and there are no games on it that were made by Nintendo, which is kind of weird why it's on Switch Online. But essentially, the Mega Drive / Genesis is obviously the second Sega console, third Sega home console. It is obviously includes some games like Sonic the Hedgehog 2. It's got some iconic Sega games on there, but also with Sega games being so widely released, it doesn't feel like it's a necessary purchase if you're not already into those games. Then I don't see why you'd want to use them. And also, if you're into those games, you probably would have bought like the multiple versions of the collection they've done over the years. Then we want to move over to the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance is just basically a souped-up Game Boy. It's got better graphics. It's obviously got arguably some better games as well. Games like WarioWare hit its stride on the Game Boy Advance. And, games like, Zelda the Minish Cap is on the service as well, which is great to see. It's quite an iconic Zelda game. And, that's basically it. Game Boy Advance plays great as well, especially because, obviously, the Switch has obviously dual shoulder buttons, which is great for Game Boy Advance emulation. Then we have the GameCube. Now, the GameCube, this is where it gets controversial. It's a Switch 2 only app. You can only get this app if you have the Switch 2. It doesn't run on the Switch 1, and it only has 5 games at the time of making this video. But it's nice to see the GameCube come to the service, because obviously the GameCube is quite an iconic console. It wasn't a huge hit back in the day, but it's nice to see Nintendo embrace their history a bit more. And saying that, we have the last console on the list, the Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy is coming soon. It's coming February 2026. It's not out yet. But it is quite an interesting pick, because obviously the Virtual Boy itself, failed. It was a failure of a console. 777,000 consoles sold. It was on the market for 6 months, and only had about 14 games released for it. But I think it's nice that Nintendo is actually going to revisit this system and make those games available on the Switch 1 and Switch 2. And there's also going to be a stand you can use to play the games as well. Honestly, I like the fact Nintendo is doing this with Switch Online. I feel like the fact they're embracing their legacy a bit more, it's nice to see, especially as many other game companies have sort of moved away from that and let a lot of their classic games, to die. So it's nice to see Nintendo re-releasing them on a way for many people to actually check out these games. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, like, share, comment, turn notifications. I've been EC, and I'm signing out. Peace.